This morning, if you'll turn to the book of James, our teen class, like I said, I'm really enjoying that class. We have an excellent group of high schoolers. I say teenagers, they're high schoolers. I know some might be already graduated, but our high school class, they're doing an excellent job in studying with me from the book of James, a very practical book. Some would say the most practical in all the New Testament. That is, that it just deals with life day by day. And that's true whether you're a teenager or a retiree or somewhere in between, older or younger, it doesn't matter. This morning, we were prepared to study, and I'll just invite you to study right along with me, what the lesson is titled, Gifts from God, from James chapter 1, verse 17, and then James chapter 4, verses 13 to 17, and then James chapter 5, verses 13 to 20. We're not taking it verse by verse, but we're looking at the book in a more topical fashion. But this morning, Gifts from God. Now, here's the way I was going to introduce it for the teen class, and if you want a copy of this handout, I can get Sonia to email one out to you either later on this afternoon or more likely tomorrow if you're interested in that. But I put on that first paragraph, growing up, I was more terrified than thrilled at the idea of an old, obese, bearded man in a red velvet suit sneaking into my house on the night of December 24th. Or the early morning of December 25th. I must admit I was one of those strange children. That idea just kind of was a little bit more terrifying, frightening than it was comforting. I wanted to be safe with my father and mother, and I didn't need anybody to sneak in. But the idea, of course, of some gifts left behind, well, that softened, I guess, the terror a little bit. But I didn't take very long to determine the actual origin. And I'll just leave it at that, because some of you, I know you may have little ones watching with me, so that's not a discussion to have even this morning, I suppose. But this morning I want to talk about some gifts from God. And those gifts that God gives us in James chapter 1 and verse 17 are described. And they're described by a pair of modifiers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. God is the giver of every good and every perfect gift. Now, that's just simply stated, but do we really, I guess, factor that in each moment, every day, and every day with every day's gifts and blessings? All of them find their source and origin in God exclusively. It's just an amazing, amazing concept. Those words that are used by James are vital. And that word every that modifies, that tells us the extent. Every good, every perfect. It's not the case, although it would be marvelous even if the word were some or most. But that's not what the text says. It tells us, in fact, that every good and every perfect gift is from above. Emphasized twice, meaning that it excludes none, originate from the hand of God. Now, most people fail to understand that He is the ultimate source of these good blessings. Most people think that they themselves are in some way responsible for what they have and what they have received. If not themselves individually, they might point and say, well, it was my parents. They sacrificed. They worked hard to provide me with what I have, and I capitalized on my upbringing, and so I've done well, consequently, and now I'm passing that on to my children. Certainly many highlight the blessings of living in this United States of America, which I'm thankful for as well, and the blessings we are afforded in our system of governance, we treasure, and the threat maybe to that being altered or maybe even diminished, and again, this isn't necessarily the time or place for that discussion, but you know that that's on the forefront of many people's minds. And so we are troubled by, will we continue to enjoy such blessings as we do living in this particular country in this period of time in history? Well, all of that aside, even though those things may contribute, the nation we live in, the work of our parents, the other fortuitous circumstances we might find ourselves in, none of that discounts In fact, all that does is simply, again, highlight these blessings are from God. Now, in the teenage class, I try to get them to participate with me, and so I can't really do that. I can ask a question, and if they want to yell at the TV, go right ahead. That might annoy your parents a little bit, but I'll try to just imagine what they might say with these discussion questions that I intended on asking them. And the first one was simply this: name some gifts that only God can give. Now that's important because I think that just shows us somewhat of this verse in action. What are some gifts? Well, you think of gifts, you think of things that you can give to others, and the things that we can purchase that are manufactured and made that we can give to others. But there are things that if we keep kind of backing up that we realize only come from God. And the very first one that I was going to ask them to think about is think of the gift of water. A very simple thing. Now, it's in snow form outside, if you've looked outside, and you know from science class how it exists in different states, whether a solid or a liquid or a gas. But it's impossible. Well, I say it's impossible. This is something for the theoretical physicists and other chemistry folks. Sister McDuffie, we could maybe interview her on this sometime. But as I understand it, our efforts, human beings, to make water, they're really not fraught with any success, but in fact with spectacular failure, even though we know the components. Now, we can't make hydrogen and we can't make oxygen, so that discounts that we can even make it. But even having those, if you will, basic materials, 2 atoms of hydrogen and an atom of oxygen, to combine those to make what we call water, the very most basic substance needed for life. Some would say that's hydrogen, but anyways, combining those 2 elements together to make water, which is essential to all of our well-beings and continued existence. We can't do that. We just can't do that. Something as simple as that. Now, what's the explanation? Well, those who discount God or eliminate Him altogether say, well, that was just kind of how the universe fell into place. Well, you've heard my thoughts before about how nonsensical I believe things like that really are. I'll just leave that there, but that's one gift that only God can give. Only God can give us the sunshine that we receive, the air that we breathe, and on and on and on we could go. The question I was going to follow that up with him is, why does God give? And the only reason that we can really say in the final analysis is because He loves us. There might be some other reasons, but that's the simple summary. By nature, that is, what makes God God is love. And when you love something, you care for it, you provide for it. And that might be true for a puppy dog, or that might be true for an automobile that you take care of. Hopefully it's true of the people that you hold closest, but you try to protect them, you try to care for them, and you realize that all that you're doing is really trying to do with what God has given you to help them. And so that's what James 1 verse 18 is really just trying to emphasize to us. God is that giver. Now, James calls God the Father, notice, of lights. James says that every good gift, every perfect gift is from above, comes down from the Father of lights. Now, that Father of lights could be a reference to His creation of the sun, moon, and stars. Genesis 1 tells us that. And how He did that, other than by saying, let there be light, and there was light. We talked about in the adult class on this past Wednesday evening that through Jesus all things were created. Man has searched, and they fill blackboards and other experiments full of equations and experiments and all of these sorts of things to try to get at some physical causation to explain how all of these things came about. And it's amazing, all of the work that has been done and the research that has given insight into much of that, and yet still much of it unexplainable. And much of it, of course, the complexity of it and yet the order of it should testify to these men and women doing such studies of some power that is greater and that has arranged it in the marvelous way in which He has. I could get off on that, but nevertheless, God is the source of all good things. So He is the Father of lights. Darkness in Scripture often describes sin and evil and wickedness. The devil is identified as the power of darkness, and Jesus delivers us from that, according to Colossians 1, verse 13. But there is no shadow of turning. There is no variation with God. no variableness. One of the older versions says that's another way of simply saying God never changes in the way that He gives. Now, I know maybe just saying that without qualifying it causes some to scratch their head and say, well, sometimes I have more and sometimes I have little, or sometimes I have this and sometimes I receive that. What do you mean that God never changes in His giving? Certainly He does change in the way that particular blessings may be bestowed. He may have a specific time in our lives when we enjoy one thing, and at other times that may be kept from us. And only He in His wisdom knows why it is best for that to be the case. But what it means here when James says He is the Father of lights and there is no variation or shadow of turning, simply that He's not temperamental. He doesn't decide, well, I'm going to be generous today, but tomorrow I'm going to be stingy. Now, those teenagers, if I ask them to be honest, and my two even that are in the class, what about your parents? Are they temperamental sometimes? I know that mine would nod their heads in agreement and say, sure he is. Sometimes he's in a good mood, sometimes he's in a bad mood. Sometimes he switches in the middle of the sentence or the conversation with us. He lets us do this, but he won't let us do that. And tomorrow, that's just the way we are as people. But God is not temperamental. God is not generous some of the time or loving part of the time, and at other times opposed to us. No, He is kind and gentle, compassionate and merciful. Yes, He is loving, and we'll talk about at the worship hour what love involves. And it doesn't always mean getting anything I want in the way that I want it. It most certainly does not mean that, but that's what James is telling us. Whether that's a reference, some say the variation or shadow of turning, the way that the sun on an ancient sundial would cast a shadow. I don't know, that's a possibility, I guess, in the interpretation. Jesus just said, the Father causes the sun to rise on the good and on the evil, the just and the unjust. You remember in Matthew 5. So that's the basis in James 1:17 for the giving God, the gift from God. But then we will skip, and I'll invite you to go ahead and skip to James chapter 4. Let's look at verses 13 to 17. When we think about gifts from God, James is going to tell us there's something we need to understand about how God gives and what we do with what He gives. And the gift that he is really talking about here in this passage is the gift of time. Let's read it together. James 4, beginning in verse 13. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow, we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell, and make a profit. Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. But now you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. The gift of time. Each day of physical life is a renewal of this blessing. The past is over and cannot be changed in any way, as much as we would like it to be. Different in some respects, decisions that were made poorly to be corrected, things that were enjoyed to be enjoyed once more in the fullness of them. The past is gone and will not return. The future is yet to arrive and is uncertain, as James tells us here. And so every moment is a gift, this very moment. And someone said that's why it's called the present. Well, that's a little pun on words, I guess, and perhaps so. Amazingly, time is not a construct that applies to God. This was something I wanted to discuss with the teenagers. I actually did it with the adult class a little bit on this past Wednesday night, again talking about Jesus being eternal. And that's a mind-broadening, mind-blowing, actually, I guess would be the more correct way of putting it, idea. Time does not apply to God. And that's something our feeble minds can just scarcely grasp the fringes of. We might think, I kind of got an idea of what that means, but not really. God had no beginning and He'll have no end. And when we think of eternity, we may have a lot of different ideas, but we're finite and must relate to the reality of time. That's just how God made us. And so James warns us here in this passage about 3 sins that cause us to misuse the gift of time. And I'll ask you to explore them with me. Number 1, notice he said there is a sin of presumption. We can take the gift of God that God gives us of time, and we can misuse it by presumption. Verses 13 to 15. Come now, you who say, and this is what they're doing, they're presuming, today or tomorrow we'll go to such and such a city. We'll spend a year there, buy, sell, make gain. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Life like a vapor, yes, a fog. It's dense. It seems so substantive for a little while, the early morning, but then it vanishes away. Instead, tell the Lord that you're going to consider His plans. If you will, then we'll do this or that. That's the idea. James describing a business person here who's making plans. Notice his plans involve time. They involve place, duration, activity, and result. I mean, this is kind of the way you would put together a business model. And those that have had business experience or certainly business classes know this is, the proper way to go about it. And I've got to determine, the time I'm going to invest, the place, the duration, the activity, and what I expect to get out of it. Kind of a feasibility study in a nutshell. Now, the question I was going to ask them, and I'll ask you, is it a sin to plan? Is that what James is saying? Is it a sin to plan, to prepare? Absolutely not. How do you know that? Well, simply because God plans. Now, again, if you want to get into a philosophical debate on this matter, it's really going to only cause us to end up kind of going around in circles and not making really any proper headway. God, as eternal, again, doesn't view time as we do, so He sees the beginning from the end. That's the way one verse puts it, but He sees it all in totality. We can't do that, but we do know, for instance, in Ephesians chapter 1, the book of Revelation, and a variety of other places tell us that God has an eternal plan. Jesus was, as Scripture calls Him, the Lamb slain before the foundation of the world. The scheme of redemption whereby God would save man through Jesus, He knew before Genesis 1 verse 1 ever occurred, with a beginning and point in time when He started creating. So it's beyond the scope of our, again, limited, finite minds to truly grasp that. But what it does show us is that there is order. And God does not do things in a chaotic fashion. God does not react, if you will. God has responded to what man has done. And so that's just, again, beyond really my understanding on a deep, deep level. Nowhere near the level of depth that God has in how He has dealt with us. So it's not a sin to plan. The problem with planning and where it becomes sinful, presumption, James tells us here, is when I do not leave room for God in my plans. Here's an individual who said, I've got it all figured out. I know what I'm going to do, where I'm going to go, what I'm going to get as a result. I know all of that. And so millions continue to make that same mistake day after day. They were making it in James's day. They make it today. If the world stands in 100 years from now, people will still be making plans without God and still failing. Jesus taught about another man, you remember in Luke 12, who made plans, who said, I've got it made. Everything's, turned out well. I look at the balance sheet and I'm in good shape. I can take it easy. I'll just sit back. I'll tell the servants, build more barns. Sales are just going through the roof. That graph, it doesn't have any dips in it. It's only going up. And I'll take it easy in retirement. That's my simply retelling of Luke 12, 16 to 21. And you remember as Jesus retold that account, He said that God Himself said to that man, you're a fool. Tonight, your soul will be required of you. And so the sin of presumption is a way that we can misuse God's gift of time. But number two, notice that the sin of boasting affects how we misuse God's gift of time. Verse 16, now you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. It's really, I think, the inevitable outcome of presumption. It's not enough just to presume that what we're going to do. It seems the devil isn't even confident to leave us in that position. If he's deceived us into thinking we don't need God, then most of the time, most people that I know also then will boast accordingly. I've got it made. I know what's going to happen. Again, they may not say those words verbatim. They may not be so brash as to make that overt. type of declaration, but nevertheless, that's the way they're living. I've got it all figured out. I don't need anyone else's help. I don't need even God's assistance or guidance. Here's the way it's going to go. And they boast, many times even in that sort of way, whether with their words or certainly by their actions. They assert their ability and power, but it's a formula for disaster. As we said earlier, nothing that happened in the past we can change. And it's here that James warns us it's nothing in the future that we can control. Now, I know every time you say that, can we control anything about the future? Well, the answer is a little complicated. In one sense, there are things that we can do to help prepare for the future. And there's nothing wrong, as I've said, in doing that. In fact, maybe the best, well, it's not even perhaps, I know without a doubt, let me say it plainly, the best thing that any individual can do. We can control our eternal destiny. Not because, again, of our own power or ability or merit, but because God has so graciously told us what to do in order to have our sins forgiven, to be able to stand before Him justified and righteous and forgiven of sins on Judgment Day. I need to accept the forgiveness that He offers through Jesus Christ. I need to be obedient to the gospel and do the things that He says I must do in order to wash my sins away. I must do all that He commands in order to be in a right standing with Him. And if I do that, He promises me, He tells me that I can have confidence even as I face death. And that's true again every day. We might think, well, that's when I get a terminal disease diagnosis. No, you can face every day knowing that if this is it, if this is the last day, if I go to meet my Maker this day before the sun closes or before the sun rises tomorrow morning, I can have assurance that I'll be prepared. And that's the joy of living the Christian life. So can we control anything about the future? Yes, in that sense we can, and the wisdom in doing that, I think all of us must agree, is paramount. And that's what we're trying to convince people to do. However, at the same time, we need to ask, can we control the future as it relates to particular events and circumstances? And that answer, of course, is no. All of us have had the experience that the old little maxim or cliche teaches. Man proposes, but God disposes. And that is, there are things that we do, that we plan on, that just do not happen the way that we thought that they would. Don't count your chickens before they hatch is another old country saying that warns us. We need to be aware. We may have ideas and plans. We may make adequate or even exceptional preparation. And all of that through just the big word I like is vicissitudes of life. It just means all the stuff that, we don't know is going to happen or how it's going to play out. Sometimes they do. And then we have to alter our plans. Sometimes those plans are destroyed altogether. Those of you that are regular folks here, maybe there's someone visiting that don't know, but a lot of my prior experience in my adult life was spent working in the funeral industry. And I remember just almost without question from time to time in just visiting with people as they were visiting with a family who had lost a loved one. Almost without exception, at some point during that period of time, someone would make the observation, well, we just don't know what's going to happen. We just don't know about tomorrow, or I wasn't expecting this, especially, of course, in a time of accident or tragedy when life was taken. And I remember, I won't share the individual's identity, but we were there one day at one particular time of visitation with a family that had lost a loved one. And this gentleman, it was a man, he said, we don't know who it'll be next time. It might be me here the next time. And guess what? Sure enough, it was. Before another 7 days had passed, that gentleman had passed away unexpectedly. And many of those same people were back again to pay their respects to him. That's just one example of many that can be cited. And we know James is telling us, don't boast. Don't boast. You think you've got it figured out? you better include God and make sure that you're factoring Him in and doing as He said. And that's, again, not a lesson to scare our teenagers. You may say, well, this is the teen class, you're trying to scare them. No, not necessarily, although I can share with them a number of different stories, dozens of individuals I have known. Some of them personally, very closely, that never reached even half the age that I am now. And that's a reality. So James says, God gives you the gift of time. Don't presume. Don't boast. Instead, include God in your plans. And then the third sin that we can be guilty of, misusing God's gift of time, is what verse 17 tells us, the gift of omission. To him, to the one that knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. Now, this verse, I admit, troubled me for a long time. And, I think we can almost remove it from its context and use it almost like a sledgehammer, either on ourselves in our own guilt-ridden, evaluation of how we act, or we can use it against other people. And I've been guilty of both, I'm sure. But we can think, well, any good thing that I could have done, I didn't do it, and so I'm sinning. And you think about that just over the course of a day, and you want to be discouraged, just think about all of the opportunities that you've missed. Am I saying that God is content and going to look the other way when I neglect doing what He asked me to do? No, I'm not saying that. But neither am I telling you that verse 17 should be used, again, whether you use it on yourself or whether you try to maybe coerce or tell other people, well, that's the good thing to do and you didn't do it, so you're a sinner, to maybe try to inflict guilt on them. Again, that's something that maybe as a parent or preacher I've been too guilty of. In context, though, considering how James has given us this section, I think it would be wiser, maybe more in line with what he was originally intending, to say, James is saying, knowing that God gives you the gift of time, knowing that you can do good by making your plans, including Him in them, that's what you need to do. To not do that, it's sinful. Now, again, we typically portray sin just as doing the wrong thing, the bad thing. We think about the commission of sin. Another accurate way, though, James says, of communicating what sin is the failure to do the good things that God commands. And especially in our plans, maybe this is a warning about the failure to take advantage of opportunities. The failure to take advantage of opportunities. One of the men that I love dearly, who's had a great impact on my life, especially over the last 15 years, is Brother Alan Baltimore. He's actually married to our sister Sarah White's niece, Karen, and Karen's been having some health troubles. We've prayed for her lately, but he served as one of the elders at the Allen's congregation during my ministry there. And in his prayer, where he picked up this little phrase, I don't know, other than maybe a study of this passage, but he often prayed and he would ask God, please forgive us for the times when we didn't do something that would have made a difference. And maybe he varied the slight language of that in the phraseology, but that was always and still is, as I remember it, so very impactful. Think about the times when you might have made a difference. And think about the times, sadly, and we'll have to do this individually, it is discouraging even for me to think about the times when I didn't make a difference. And maybe I could have. That's what James is warning us about here. Now, can anybody do everything? No, no one can do everything. But we can, in most cases, maybe see that there were times when I could have done more, could have done something, even without doing more, just have done anything. And so we ought to pray for courage and wisdom to do better in the future. And what can we do about those missed opportunities now? Well, we can just learn from them. We could lament them. We could be discouraged, or we could say, God, help me to do better going forward. And that's what I urge you to do. The last set of verses, James 5, 13 to 20, is where I was going to take the kids. And this is a very involved passage about several points that especially maybe they're curious about, and you are too. I wasn't going to delve into that a lot, but James tells us we have the gift of prayer. The gift of prayer. Now, that gift of prayer is simply acknowledging to God that He's in control, that He is the source of every good and perfect gift. That's what prayer is. Prayer is not telling God, hey God, in case you didn't figure it out or you haven't taken notice lately, here's what's happening, here's what you need to do about it. Now that sounds terrible, doesn't it? I'm just using that for dramatic effect, but that's almost it seems the mindset that some people tend to think about when they think about prayer, maybe even that they pray with. God, here's what's happening, here's what you need to do about it. That's not what prayer is. Prayer is simply saying, God, I know you know what's going on. I know you know that my needs are great. And I know that my needs will be blessed and my life helped by your assistance. And whatever gifts you can give in this process, that's what I seek. And those things are humbly requested. And we can pray with confidence, just as James tells us here. He tells us we can pray when we're suffering, verse 13. That word is generic enough to include so many different things in life, not just physical sickness or disease, but many other issues could be included under that heading of suffering. So pray. He tells us we should pray specifically in a time of sickness, verse 14 and 15. And yes, there is that curious mention here of calling for the elders of the church and them praying over the individual, anointing them with oil in the name of the Lord, and the prayer of faith will save the sick. There is debate over whether this is a spiritual sickness, as we might call it, or a physical sickness. I don't think that you can really exclude either. Certainly in calling for the elders, they would be and certainly are qualified, and as shepherds of the sheep, to take care of both physical and spiritual illness as they can. The anointing with the oil is that ancient custom that was symbolic as Samuel anoints David, 1 Samuel 16:13. It's medicinal, Luke 10, verse 34. The Good Samaritan pours on oil and wine. Wine is an antiseptic there, the oil to maybe help with the pain of the man who had been beaten. So people look at that and say, well, do we do that today? It could be done. I don't know of any reason why you would exclude someone from doing it, but understanding the purpose of it in the ancient world, the custom that's involved with it, more likely today you would say they would be able to help him if he needed to secure medication for his illness. I think that would be a parallel that would not do any injustice to what James is here asking us to do. But they are to be summoned and can be summoned to help in these times of need. The sins that they have committed would be forgiven. That seems to be, again, that spiritual aspect of the particular struggle the individual may be having. Confess your trespasses, your sins to one another, and pray for one another that you may be healed. There are those who say, well, that's what we do at the end of a service when we invite people to come and share their struggles. That can be included in that. It seems that this is more, in my estimation, more something, though, that is done between Christians, maybe because they have a close relationship with each other, and they're to help each other, they're to encourage one another, taking the totality of New Testament teaching. But the last part of verse 16 is something that we need to really focus in on regardless of our age. The effectual or effective fervent prayer of a righteous man, a righteous person, avails much. Of course, he's talking about the child of God. And make of that what you will, and oftentimes we want to say how. And how does God do that? How does prayer do that? You're going to get into a very detailed analysis and involved discussion on the nature of God and His knowledge and His wisdom and His actions and His eternal nature. All of that, just set that aside. Simply think about what James was telling these people in the first century who didn't even have a copy of this letter but only heard it read in a public setting. And when they heard it read in a public setting, the effectual fervent prayer of righteous people accomplishes much. What's that mean? Well, that must mean James says, keep praying. Keep praying. It has benefits and it has power, not in what you're doing, but in what God does through prayer. Again, is there somewhat of a mysterious component of this? In my mind there is. I don't understand how prayer works exactly. If you do, I'll be happy to listen while you enlighten me, and I'll try to learn from you to know it better. But what I take from it very simply is that prayer from the child of God, and notice it is the one that is righteous, and we're only made righteous through Jesus, but for those who are righteous because they are obedient to Jesus, thus children of God, when they pray, much is accomplished. And maybe only God knows the extent of what is actually accomplished, and we trust Him to do what is right. Elijah is mentioned as a man who prayed and great results happened. And so that powerful promise gives us an illustration of the potency of prayer. And then in verse 19 and 20 don't mention prayer. And some say, should they be included? I don't know. I just did it because of our time constraints in our teenage class to get through the entire book. Brethren, if a man wanders from the truth, someone turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his way will save a soul from death and cover a multitude of sins. Simply put, we need to help each other. As Christians, we must help each other because we all have spiritual struggles. And we all need strength. We all need to be encouraged. The devil will discourage us at every turn. He'll try to tear us down. And so often we've allowed him to do that. We've allowed him to do that to our brothers and sisters without intervening to try to help them. Now, I think it might also need to be said, there are times when those who struggle spiritually are unwilling to receive help. They're not receptive to that assistance, or maybe the spiritual struggle they're dealing with, and it's easy to see the problem, and they're unwilling to let go of it. They're too tempted to go back into the world. They're not going to be as spiritually committed as they ought to be. All of those things being true, but let it never be said that one wanders from the truth without our concern. Let it never be said that there is one who never knows our concern and love for them to come back to the truth. How do we do that? Do we do that with phone calls and letters and emails and text messages, just telling people, hey, we're concerned about you? That's a start. The elders, even at this place, are so very diligent in helping those who wonder. They, in a personal way, visit and often admonish. And when that admonishment goes unheeded, of course, church discipline is also included in this process. We don't have time to discuss that at length this morning. But for all of us, even if we're not in that role in providing that leadership and disciplinary action, we ought to be very kind and very just intentional and very purposeful in telling people we are so concerned. We love you so much. We don't want you to go in that direction because it leads only to your separation from God, your eternal destruction. I know some people are more maybe suited to help in those ways. Some are too maybe brash. That's an opinion I don't know if I always hold or not. I told an individual a couple of years ago, and it didn't have the desired result that I wanted to, but they kept kind of ignoring some of my attempts to kind of get through with them, and I finally told them, I'm not going to lie at your funeral if you don't shape up. You think you'll, and they had asked me to participate in that way, and I said, I can't lie. I can't make you out to be something that you're not. If you don't start living the way God wants you to live, I'm going to tell everybody that you didn't. Well, they've not to this point. Maybe that was too arrogant of me or too cruel of me to make such a judgment. But people are going toward, as James says, death. So let's turn them back. Eternal destruction is something we want for no one, not even for our enemies. The gifts of God. Our time is gone this morning, but I hope that you have grown in your appreciation for them. God gives us the gift of prayer, James 5, 13 to 20. James 4, 13 to 17, God gives us the gift of time. And what great blessings even prayer and time are. And then back to James 1, verse 18, or verse 17 rather, where we started. God gives us every good gift and every perfect gift. That should drive us to our knees continually with the gratitude and the appreciation for how much He loves us. There is no justification, no rationale where any individual should be filled with pride in the sense of being superior to others, or even, again, unwilling or feeling as if God were unnecessary to their lives. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. Comes down from our generous Father, who is loving, and how kind He has been to us, what good gifts He has supplied.